Hi there, and welcome to this week's video lesson. We're going to be talking about the Treaty of Versailles this week and the post-war peace after World War I. So let's get underway, shall we? Okay, so before the war even ended, Woodrow Wilson already had a plan for managing the peace that would come. This plan was known as the 14 points. I'm not going to make you memorize all of the provisions of the 14 points, but some of the examples were an end to the entangling alliances that had helped to start the war, removal of trade barriers, decreased military forces, self-determination for Austria-Hungary's ethnic minorities, things like that. Wilson proclaimed that when the United States actually entered the war, at the time that they entered the war, that we were fighting to make the world safe for democracy. Wilson also walked in proclaiming that the United States in this war did not want any territorial gain and did not want any monetary gain at the peace conference that was to follow the war. The United States was not interested in those things. Now, the United States' allies, Britain and France, on the other hand, they walked in saying they wanted territorial gain. That was one of the things they had fought the war for, was to make their empires bigger. Number two, they wanted money. They wanted to charge Germany reparations for their part in the war. And number three, they wanted to punish Germany basically to watch it bleed. That was the idea. So this was fundamentally opposed to what Wilson had brought up. Now, Wilson, I don't think, really made a comment on the punishing Germany to watch it bleed thing. I think he was willing to go along with his European brethren who had just spent 4 years fighting a war on that front. But the United States was not going to take any of that reparations money. In the picture you see here, you will notice on the left is David Lloyd George. He was the Prime Minister of Great Britain at the time. In the center, looking a bit like a walrus, is Georges Clemenceau, I forget if he's Prime Minister or President of France. And then, of course, Woodrow Wilson. So in the beginning, incidentally, there were supposed to be 4 big kahunas at this peace conference. Originally, it was supposed to be Britain, France, Russia, and Italy. So Italy had been promised a whole bunch to switch sides. They had originally been allied with Austria-Hungary, and they were persuaded via promises of practically the moon and stars to get them to change sides and support the Allies. And one of the other things they were promised was at the peace conference they were going to be a major deal. Here's the 4 of them together. I don't remember the name of the Italian prime minister. It doesn't much matter. Basically, the British and the French are going to see to it that Italy is pushed largely to the side. And we'll talk more about this later on. So just another lovely picture. I apologize that it's a bit pixelated of Clemenceau, Wilson, and Lloyd George. Again, Clemenceau, walrus, Lloyd George looking a bit like the cat that ate the canary. So because of his rhetoric prior to coming to the Versailles Conference, which, by the way, was a very much unprecedented move for an American president. No American president had ever left the confines of the United States during their time in office. Wilson was the first. And so when he showed up with all of his talk of freedom and making the world safe for democracy and self-determination and all of this stuff, the people of Paris and those that had gathered there are going to treat the man as a hero. They are going to throw roses and flowers at his feet. Please notice that's what's happening here. So they really believed in what Wilson was kind of pitching, which was this idealized notion of what the world could be after the war. And I'm here to tell you that's not actually going to happen. Here's just a lovely painting of the various parties at the Treaty of Versailles. in the actual Versailles Palace, in the conference room there, the meeting room there. This was the home of the French kings prior to the French Revolution. They did not tear it down because it was quite the architectural marvel. Okay, so ultimately, the peace treaty will be signed, and Wilson's 14 points, when it's all said and done, 13 of them are going to get thrown out the window. The nations that were there were not interested in Wilson's sort of high and mighty ideas about how this war should end and how this peace should be. The one thing he got to keep was this idea known as the League of Nations, that was basically kind of a collective security agreement for the world. An attack on one league nation was an attack on all of them. This is going to make that provision very controversial when it gets back to the United States, by the way. But Wilson, that's the part he gets to keep, and I think he was pretty happy with that. I think that's the part he was really after saving, where countries could sit down amongst themselves and solve disputes before wars started happening, was kind of the idea. So one of the powers that was at this conference were the Japanese. The Japanese had actually been highly involved in the war, not only in Asia, but they had sent fighters to the Mediterranean who had fought in that part of the war. So Japan was thinking that they were going to be fairly big players in all of this. And they noticed that in the League of Nations, there was no provision granting racial equality to, various different parts of the League. If you were part of the League, the Japanese felt that you should have to guarantee racial equality inside your country, not only to foreign nationals, but also to those that were already there. So the Japanese proposed this language. The equality of nations being a basic principle of the League of Nations, the high contracting parties agree to accord as soon as possible to all alien nationals of states, members of the League, equal and just treatment in every respect, making no distinction either in law or in fact on account of their race or nationality. Okay, so this was obviously going to be controversial. The Japanese were obviously arguing for this because they were themselves a racial seeming minority in all of this. There were only two Asian nations, I think, at the conference at Versailles. The other one was China. And so when they proposed this, it's amazing, though, that 11 of the 17 delegates present in the League of Nations Committee voted for it. But here's the problem. The countries that were not for it included Great Britain and France. The Americans hadn't really taken a side. Wilson was chairing the meeting. But Britain and France also had their colonial possessions that had seats at the table. Australia, New Zealand, Canada, etc. And these were all places that were struggling with a white minority attempting to kind of, for lack of a better term, bulldoze over the rights of what had been a majority at one point. But they had been working to cut that down. But in any case, in Australia, they had the Aboriginal people. In India, obviously, the Indian people were struggling against British rule already. New Zealand had the Maori people. Canada had Native Americans. South Africa had a white minority with pure legal powers over the black majority. And none of those countries wanted to provide racial equality within their country. And the British didn't particularly want to adopt it within their empire. They would have had to treat the Indians the same as the white people in Britain. They would have had to treat the Aboriginal people in Australia the same as white people in Britain, etc. And they were not keen on that at that point. Now, nowadays, Britain's actually a very strong mix of lots of different peoples from around the world. But at this time, no, not so much. So even though it was 11 of 17 delegates present voted to adopt it, the chair, Woodrow Wilson, ruled that the vote had failed. And so, and that was all that was said about the matter. The chair's word was final. And so no racial equality provision was put into the League of Nations. And Japan leaves basically feeling like they really can't rely on the West to cooperate with them. And so if they want to become a self-sufficient empire, which is what they were after, and they were short on things like petroleum, rubber, steel, etc., they were going to have to go and conquer territories that had those things so that they could make them or refine them or whatever. And so this is just a picture of some Japanese diplomats and military officials and whatnot. So Japan's going to start turning very militaristic. And by the middle part of the late 20s, early 30s, Japan is going to be on the march, and they're going to be conquering parts of China and other little parts of Asia, culminating in December 7th, 1945, when they're not only going to attack Pearl Harbor, but they're going to attack and try and conquer places like Hong Kong, Malaya, Guam, the Philippines, basically territorial possessions of other empires. So again, the Japanese leave disappointed due to the failure of their racial equality provision. They didn't get the territories that they'd been promised. They had been promised German colonies in the Pacific. They did not gain those after the war. The British and the French took those over. They did get the Shandong region of China. China protests that because, China was part of the Allied powers too. China and one other country are the only Allied countries that lose territory in this war. The other country was Russia, and they sought a separate peace. So this was very disappointing for China. Basically, they went, wait a minute, we're an Allied power too. What the heck? But Japan got a hold of that region of China. So moving on to Italy. Italy is, and we kind of talked a little bit about this before, they had been promised a whole bunch. South Tyrol, Dalmatian coast, major parts of the Balkans were promised to them. They had lost 600,000 men in battle, which compared to the United States lost 50,000. So the Italians felt like they had done 12 times the dying, then they should get 12 times more stuff out of the whole deal. And they ended up just being marginalized at the Versailles Conference. They were only awarded slivers of the territory that they were promised. And so the Italian prime minister actually leaves kind of in a huff because, basically he'd been deceived. Fast forward to 1925, and a guy named Benito Mussolini, a newspaper editor, had been publishing editorials for quite some time, decrying that Italy had basically gotten hosed over in the Treaty of Versailles, and that they needed to do something about it. And so he and his friends together, they all put on black shirts, and they were known as the Black Shirts, and they marched on the king's palace in Rome. And the king, who was old and tired, said, okay, fine, you can be prime minister. And so he set about first trying to settle Italian society, make the trains run on time. In other words, Italy was famous for no schedules at all. And then he turned his attention to reforming what he called a new Roman Empire. And he attacked countries in Africa. He attacked, at one point, Greece, to try and bring them into this new Roman Empire to expand Italy's prestige. So not to get too far into World War II, but that's what's headed for Italy after all of this. So lots of roots for World War II and other things here in the Treaty of Versailles. In the Middle East, so we didn't talk a lot about this in class simply because the Americans didn't fight in the Middle East at that point nowadays. But no, so that was where the Ottoman Empire was, and the Ottomans were about 2 strong breaths away from collapsing anyway. And so as the war is ending, Kemal Ataturk is going to declare the secular nation of Turkey, hence Ataturk, Turkey. And that was supposed to be a secular country in that area of the world. Nowadays, not quite so secular. But what had also happened during that war is that the British and the French had made a deal with one of the leaders on the Arabic Peninsula, the Arabian Peninsula. And they had promised this guy control of a pan-Arab nation if he would lead the Arab people in a revolt against the Ottomans, which he did. Well, after the war, the British and the French kind of go, I don't think we're going to do quite that. And so they do give the guy control of most of the Arabian Peninsula, hence Saudi Arabia. He's actually the founding member of the Saudi royal family. But they give areas to the north that were supposed to be a part of this pan-Arabic country to his sons. But they make them protectorates for several years. So the British and the French are really calling the shots, so the sons can't just give the territory back to daddy. And these are the nations of Jordan, Iraq, and Syria. Now, these are brand new countries that were drawn at the Versailles Peace Conference, and those that drew them made no distinction, no respect for anybody that currently lived there. They just saw brown-skinned people and went, oh, they're all brown-skinned people. They must belong together. Well, there are lots of different groups in that area that don't necessarily all get along. In Iraq, for example, this new country of Iraq, they lumped together the Kurds, which also had a sizable population in southern Turkey. The Kurdish people would like to take from southern Turkey and northern Iraq and make their own country called Kurdistan, but neither the Iraqis or the Turks are allowing that to happen. So they are stuck. So they're in the north. In the middle of Iraq is the far minority of the three groups. These are known as the Sunni Muslims, also known as the traditional Muslims. And then in the south are the Shia Muslims. These are the ones that believe that a Messiah figure is returning. And so they have developed a very elaborate priesthood, or what they call mullahs, to basically guard the faith until the Messiah returns. These three groups don't get along particularly well, particularly the Sunnis and the Shias really don't get along all that well, but they're lumped into a country together. The only way they ever came together and functioned was with a strong-armed dictator like Saddam Hussein at the helm. After the death of Saddam, everything went cuckoo bananas. So anyway, so that's what's happening in Jordan, Iraq, and Syria. Now, Palestine was another country in that area, bordering Jordan and Syria. And Palestine was going to be opened thanks to something called the Balfour Declaration. They were going to be managed by Britain, and they were open to Jewish immigration, first from Britain. The British wanted to get as many Jewish people out of Britain as they possibly could. This was racist Britain time. And then later to Jews from across Europe. This really picks up after World War II with the end of the Holocaust. A lot of Jewish people don't feel they want to hang around Europe very much. And so there is a massive exodus to Palestine, even though there's already a group of people living there, the Palestinians. After World War II, the UN will divide the country into two. So the Palestinians get about half the territory that they used to call home, and the new Jewish settlers, known as Israelis, are going to get the other half. And over a series of wars in the next about 15 years, the Palestinians will lose all of their territory to Israel. So, yeah, a lot of our problems, our current problems in the Middle East, if you want to know why a lot of the residents in the Middle East don't view European or American action there very kindly, don't trust Europeans and Americans when it comes to hardly anything, it's because of it stretches back to here, and the promises made and the promises not kept after World War I, and the dividing of that territory in a way that was just completely arbitrary. They sat down with a magic marker and went, how about this? Okay, so what you see here is a map of Europe after World War One. You can see some new countries coming into being, including Austria and Hungary are different countries now. They are no longer one unified empire, and they have lost a ton of weight because some of their land went to Czechoslovakia. Yes, they thought that was a great idea. Some of it went to Poland. Some of it went to Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia was a collection of little Slavic nationalities in that Balkan region. So a lot of that Austria-Hungary territory went to those countries. You'll also notice that Germany is divided in two. So there's the bulk of Germany, and then there's that little, armpit or whatever, known as East Prussia. So the idea was the planners at Versailles wanted Poland to have a route to the sea. They wanted them to have water access. And so that's why they divided Germany that way. So they took the western part of Poland from eastern Germany, and they took the eastern part of Poland from western Russia. Remember when I said that Russia and China lost territory in the Treaty of Versailles? Well, that's where Russia loses territory. In addition to, they're going to create states like the Ukraine, which had already kind of been a region, but will be completely separated out from Russia at the time, and Belarus and some of those, and the three Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, up there. So, yeah, lots of changes going on in Europe. And remember, these were basically white nationalities that those that planned the Treaty of Versailles went, well, they can govern themselves. They're white. Meanwhile, the nations of Africa that wanted to be free, not so much. The nations of Asia that wanted to be free, not so much. The Middle East, protectorates. Yeah. Okay, so on to Germany. Germany was forced to admit sole guilt for the war, even though they hadn't started it. If you remember back to when we talked at the beginning of World War I, it was the Austro-Hungarians that they declared war on Serbia. But Austria-Hungary no longer existed. Who are they gonna punish? The guy who's no longer emperor? It didn't make any sense. So Germany had to admit sole guilt. Germany had to pay $55 billion in reparations. $55 billion. That was 1919 money. I don't even know what that would be today, but it would be, oh my gosh, lots and lots of money. It was meant so that Germany would never really be able to pay it. And that was one of the ways they were going to keep Germany down, was keep that reparations bill on their back. And that way they'd never be able to spend money on anything else other than paying reparations back. Germany's going to lose territory like Alsace-Lorraine. They're going to lose their colonial possessions. They're going to lose, obviously, that territory that goes into Poland. And their country's divided. East Prussia is no longer contiguous to the rest of the country. And Germany has to basically swallow all of this. Had Germany refused to sign, the Allies said, okay, if you don't sign, we're going to march into your country. We're going to take over. We're going to divide you into little states. And Germany's never going to come back together ever again. We're going to plunder and pillage and make sure that you don't have any resources left. And so Germany ended up signing. I have just a couple cartoons to show you. This is the reparations bill and Germany laying underneath it. And here's just a newspaper headline. Germany will sign. And this is Germany being forced to swallow the provisions of the Treaty of Versailles. And it says you've got to swallow it whether you like it or not. And that was very true. Germany couldn't really protest at the time, but that was what they had to do. And notice the guy's feeding it to him. Wilson's in the back. Lloyd George is in the front. I can't make out the one in the next to Wilson is Clemenceau. I don't know who the other guy is. Italy, maybe. And then another one of Germany being choked. Okay, so when Wilson returns from France, he has the Treaty of Versailles in hand, but the Republicans who run the Senate not so keen to actually pass it. Wilson had not consulted any of them. He had not taken senior Republicans on the trip. And so they kind of were going, we may not sign this. So Wilson is going to cross the country on a railroad trip, speaking to groups as he stops, urging them to urge their senators to support the Treaty of Versailles. One of the things that the Senate didn't like in the Treaty of Versailles was the League of Nations. They did not like that an attack on one nation was an attack on all of them. They felt it was a threat to our national sovereignty, our ability to make our own decisions. And basically, if Romania got drunk and attacked Bulgaria, the thought was we were expected to send troops, and the Senate didn't like that. The Senate liked to decide. The Senate got to decide basically when we went to war, as did the House. Congress got to decide it. And so the Senate didn't like that provision, and so they were not keen on signing this. So as Wilson was crossing the country, I believe he was on the West Coast, he starts to, he's not well. And so his wife turns the train around. They speed back to Washington, D.C., where it is discovered that he has had a massive stroke. That Wilson has had a stroke that has left the left side of his body paralyzed. He is not able to really do public appearances anymore. This all had to be horrible news for Wilson's new wife. He had met Edith Galt during his first term in office, courted her, dated her, married her, and they had only been married maybe, I think, 3 years when this hit Woodrow. And all of a sudden, she is taking care of an invalid man that she has only been married to for 3 years. So what ends up happening is she collects papers for her husband to sign. She meets with his advisors outside of his bedroom and says, okay, I'll take these in for him to sign. She goes in, closes the door, and when she comes out, they're all signed. They have not seen the president. They have not talked to the president. But all of these executive orders and bills and whatnot have been signed. Never mind that the signature looked a little different. Granted, he'd had a stroke, and your signature is going to look different after a stroke. But most historians believe that Edith Wilson was either signing these things directly or holding her husband's hand while he signed them. It is believed that Edith Wilson was basically functioning as de facto president of the United States for the last several months of Woodrow's term. He was not really able to make public appearances, public remarks. Neither did she. But at that time of history, that didn't really bother anybody. So the Senate is going to reject the Treaty of Versailles 3 times. 3 times they reject the Treaty of Versailles. Eventually, the Senate will pass a document saying that, hey, we're not fighting anymore. But it does not happen until after Wilson leaves office. So Wilson is an invalid for the rest of his time in office. He is not a candidate in 1920. He leaves office in 1921, and he dies shortly thereafter. I don't remember the exact date. But it was no more than a year or 2 after he left office that Woodrow Wilson dies. Here's just a lovely cartoon of Uncle Sam marrying foreign entitlements, which must mean the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations, and a senator coming through the church window yelling, "I object." So, kind of a fun cartoon. So anyway, the U.S. does pass a formal end to hostilities. Again, this was after Wilson left office. The U.S. is now a creditor nation. Nations of Europe owe us money because we floated them during World War I. Remember, this had nothing to do with the German reparations. We did not accept German reparations. In fact, we were going to turn around and invest in Germany. The American people, however, are going to start to turn inward. They're going to start to turn isolationist again, mainly because they felt like, Wilson had said we were fighting this war to make the world safe for democracy. Well, where's the democracy? The nations that were part of empires are mostly still part of empires. They're just part of different empires. They traded the oppressive thumb of the Germans for the oppressive thumb of the British or the French. And, so what was the difference, really? What changed? And so Americans kind of start to feel this post-war gloom that, we had fought for nothing. We had expended all this money. We'd lost 50,000 guys. And for what? For nothing. We had guys walking around not okay again because they had shell shock, what we think of today as post-traumatic stress disorder. The government canceled the war contracts when the soldiers returned home, and so jobs became more scarce. There will be a little bit of a brief recession after the war, but then about 10 years later, there's going to be a massive depression because the government policies after the war didn't take care of people like soldiers. The soldiers didn't have long-term benefits like we have today for soldiers. A lot of people just felt like they had fought for nothing. They didn't get anything out of it. In fact, the soldiers that came home discovered that those that had worked in the war industries got paid a whole heck of a lot more than they did. We're going to stop there. Here is your Week 2 video lesson journal topics. There's 3 of them. The first one, what were Britain and France's 3 goals in the Treaty of Versailles? So remember, they walked in saying they wanted 3 things. And then how did this conflict with statements by the United States? What did the United States say they didn't want? There were 2 of those things that the U.S. didn't want. Secondly, what were the treaty's impacts on Japan, Italy, and Germany? And what was the impact on the Middle East? And then finally, why did the United States turn towards isolationism after World War I? So those are your 3 topics. I'll leave them up here on the screen a little bit. Thank you for staying with us. This was actually a 2-lesson deal again. I apologize for that, but I couldn't very well just do half of the Treaty of Versailles for you. So we did the whole thing. I appreciate your patience and stick-to-itiveness throughout this. And I wish you a very good rest of your day. Have a great day. See you next time.